Hello everyone, I am Zazubaar, and welcome to a very special video. Joining me as he usually is, I have Dylan McCandless, aka Super DM64.
It's about fucking time.
Yeah, we've been planning this for a while now. What exactly that while amounts up to, it's unclear, but this is one of the many ongoing projects that we had going on that we just couldn't get off the ground. But we finally we're getting part of it off the ground after much delay. So here we are to do it for you. So Dylan, why don't you tell the good people what we're here to do tonight?
We're here to discuss probably, I don't know about you, but probably my favorite genre of film.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's my favorite genre. Yeah. We'll talk about it. I think there are so many subgenres to this more general genre that saying that is kind of, it's perhaps a bit kind of broad, but sure, yeah,
True.
why not?
I just find that most of the things I like involve this in one way or another.
I would definitely say that at the very least.
I'm of course referring to the science fiction genre, which is fucking gigantic.
It's rather broad, much like the broads in it. Hey.
And because it's broad, we're not going to sit here and just have like a discussion about it because that could go all kinds of ways.
We're not psychopaths.
Instead, we're doing something a little bit more organized, and we're presenting a list because people on the internet like lists, apparently.
They love them. The BuzzFeed has really just turned the internet into just a fucking... It's basically just a bunch of lists now. And I guess it kind of always was just a bunch of lists, but now it's a bunch of very punchy, colorful, very pithy lists. With lots of clickbait, lots of sliding pictures, lots of vague descriptions of things, which I'm sure we'll do lots of tonight.
Yeah. Lots of colorful, punchy lists. This will not be one of. This will not be one of those lists.
It'll all be in black and white, even the audio.
So we're each going to be giving our top fives here. Now, this is with a little caveat. We're going to be doing two of these videos because science fiction is, again, as Bill said, very broad. We thought it best to sort of separate it into two time periods, one being more classic sci-fi and the other one being more modern sci-fi. And the way we broke that up is pre-Star Wars and post-Star Wars.
Which is interesting because I texted you like a week ago thinking about doing this video, and I was like, but where does Star Wars fall on the list then? But we both kind of agreed that it doesn't even really belong on in this kind of list. Because it's not really traditional science fiction.
No, it's more science fantasy.
Yeah.
It's more along the lines of like your Flash Gordons of the world.
Definitely.
The 80s movies, which is very science fantasy. The original serials were more straight up sci-fi. But
yeah.
So yeah, Star Wars will not be on the list for that slight reason. It just kind of got it didn't qualify. Is what I'm trying to say.
No, in putting together the list, rewatching some of the movies, and also I watched a bunch of movies from that time period pre-Star Wars just to kind of get a broader sense of the genre than I may have had before. And it definitely does not fit in with the rest of what we're talking about, because what we're talking about is science, by and large, science fiction that takes the real world, adds a science fiction element, and then explores the impact that has on humanity to some degree. Am I right?
Yeah.
And that is not what Star Wars is about. Star Wars is the story of people that happen to have all of this great technology at their disposal that they take completely for granted, and it's about them as people.
Well, as I said, it's more science fantasy. It's its own world. It's like Lord of the Rings in space, you know what I mean?
But I think because they take the technology so for granted, they don't give a shit about a fucking spaceship. They're like, that's a piece of junk, whatever. But because they take it for granted, it's more about their individual kind of character journeys. It's not so much about the impact that the science fiction has on them. A little bit, but it's more about what they bring to the table. The science fiction we're talking about has a bit of that, but it's more about like, well, we invented this weird serum that turns you into a freak. Let's do that to a person and see how that goes. That's more of what we're kind of talking about. And not even that specifically, but just kind of the impact of scientific advancement on our modern society, social commentary, that kind of thing. Stuff set in more of a real world kind of context, I guess, is more of what we're saying.
Right. Also, other rules, very quickly. Um, in terms of franchises, we've decided to narrow it to like one movie per franchise. That way
Ooh, I
we
hope I
avoid our
followed that. I forgot about that rule. Hang on.
that way we avoid our lists of just being like Godzilla movies,
We'll
and get
talk about that.
like a wider spectrum.
Well,
Um,
I guess I'll just say this now. I didn't put Gojira on this list, even though it is one of my favorite movies of all time,
well,
and is
exactly.
technically science fiction. But I
That's
did
another
not put it
thing.
here.
That's another thing I was going to say. This is not so much a list of like objective bests.
No.
So like if we pick one movie from a franchise, it's not that we're saying that's the best movie in that franchise, merely that it's our favorite of that franchise.
Right. Well, I'm also saying that I really kind of broke up science fiction in this. Like, there's very specific reasons why I put the movies I put on my list. Like, and I didn't put Gojira on there because I just don't think that it is what we're talking about. Like, it is. It's definitely science fiction. It's definitely about scientific advancement and the impact it has on people. But it's way more about horror and kind of and destruction, and it's about a society, and I don't know. I guess everything I'm saying is exactly what qualifies the kind of science fiction we're talking about, but Godzilla has a different flavor, because it's a monster thing. And I put a monster movie on this list too. Well, I don't know. I think that Gojira is a different thing, and because also I've talked about it so many times in other videos, I wanted to get some variety in this. The way I thought about this is, here's 5 great sci-fi movies from each of us that we both really love and that we think are worth a look. That's the way I kind of thought about it.
Right. Yeah.
Also, let's throw our
sounds,
cameras on before we go any further. I forgot. Hopefully that won't mess up the good thing we have going here.
Oh yes, we've been having lots of internet issues, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, it has not been a fun time for Dylan and Bill tonight. We're both tired.
For several weeks, I've been having internet issues. I didn't make any concerted effort. It sounds like you tried to get like different flavors of sci-fi on your list. I didn't really go into that much thought about it. I mean, if we were doing top 10 lists like we were originally going to do, there probably would have been more of a variety. But as far as just like, because originally these were going to be top 10 lists, but we decided to just do 5 each to save on time.
Yeah.
But we'll mention the others in an honorable mention segment.
Yeah.
I guess before we do our number ones.
Let's save it till the very end, because what I figure we'll do is we'll do our 5. We're likely to have at least 1 or 2 that cross over. So if that happens, we can talk about that movie, and then we can each throw out an honorable mention. Then, like one that we really wanted to put on there, and then at the end we can mention all the ones that we didn't mention. That sound good?
Works for me.
All right, cool. So why don't we just get right into it then? So why don't we start with your number 5, since this was your idea? Why don't you give us your 5th? Again, it's kind of weird to call this like, your 5 favorite sci-fi movies. Dylan, tell me your 5th, the 5th sci-fi movie you wrote down that you think is great and why.
Yeah, this list has been moving around a lot, I can tell you that much.
Yeah, mine too, yeah.
But currently what I have sitting at number 5 is something that I had a little further down the list, and then I decided to swap it with what I had on for 5 originally. And that is, we were trying to be broad, but I am starting off with a kaiju flick, War of the Gargantuas.
Oh. Which
is probably my favorite non-Godzilla kaiju film that's sci-fi. My favorite non-Godzilla kaiju film would be Daimajin, but that wouldn't work on this list.
That's definitely not science fiction. There's nothing science about that.
No, it's all like magic and mythology and shit.
It's all statues coming to life and impaling men on pieces of wood.
But I mean, recently it was Gargantua's 50th anniversary. We were at G-Fest, and there was a lot of excitement around the movie, and it really just sort of
lots of mispronouncing of the monsters' names.
tons of that as well, and it really sort of reminded me how much I like the movie. And then I watched it again, and it's just fantastic. I really love the characterization that they give both the monsters and the performances. It's just excellent. It's one of the best of the genre. I could talk about why I like the genre, but I think we've talked about that plenty in the past.
Yeah, I feel bad that I didn't put any Japanese movies on my list, ultimately. I mean, I feel like that's a spoiler, maybe, but again...
there are no kaiju films whatsoever on your list.
Yeah, I left them all out because I feel like they weren't... I just feel like they're different. I consider kaiju movies to be a different genre, even from just straight up science fiction. That's a subgenre that I think is its own thing and kind of abides by its own rules. I know that that's kind of nonsense, but just when making this list, because I feel like then I would have just put all kaiju movies. Like I would have put War of the Gargantuas and Rodan and King Kong versus Godzilla and the original Gojira and Godzilla versus Biollante. That would have been my list. Yeah. So that's why I decided to leave them out. But I get that. War of the Gargantuas is a great science fiction movie.
I'll go ahead
and
say...
It has a great... the opening in particular is amazing.
I'll go ahead and say at least there'll be some variety between the two of us, because I do have 2 kaiju films on my list.
Great. No, variety is awesome. That was the point of us kind of only doing 5 each, so that way it was more like concentrated. Here's some different stuff from each of us.
I mean, and then it wound up having a huge effect on the rest of the Godzilla films. You know, they introduced like the masers, and they introduced ideas that would be used again later on, like regeneration is something that the Gargantuas do very prominently, and then you see that used again later on with Godzilla when they decide to make him a regenerating creature.
Yeah, he did kind of steal that from them, didn't he?
Yeah, because I can't think of any other Toho movie that did that. You know?
No, he regeneration was never his thing prior to, I would say, maybe even the Heisei series. Like, he was just kind of indestructible.
And even then, they didn't like state it outright.
No, it was kind of just kind of implied in that. Well, I mean, you had the thing is, you had Godzilla cells in the '90s, so it was like that kind of implies that anyway. But yeah, anyway.
And that whole idea that they were running with in the '90s of Godzilla cells like getting used to create other monsters, that kind of feels inspired by War of the Gargantuas to me, because War of the Gargantuas
very much so.
These creatures whose DNA will like pollute shit around them, and like you can't just blow them the fuck up, because if you do, there'll be a bunch of baby Gargantuas springing up everywhere.
Which also kind of inspired another recent entry in the kaiju genre that came out in America a few weeks ago.
True. Also, Reptilicus.
Is that the plot in Reptilicus? I've still never seen that.
Yeah, Reptilicus, he regenerates and shit.
Huh, okay.
At the end of the movie, they kill him, but there was like a piece of him on the ocean floor that they blew off earlier in the film, so it's like, dun, dun, dun.
Like a piece of him? Like, how big of a piece?
I think it was like an arm or something.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Because at first the Navy was... Because at first the Navy was trying to blow him up, and then there was a scientist that was like, that's a really bad idea. And so they stopped, but they did blow off a little chunk of him, and then at the end of the movie, it's like growing and shit. So it's
okay.
He's coming back. It's very similar to the end of GMK. I'm really wondering.
I was thinking about GMK when you were describing that. Is that how he grows wings? Is it like he just grows them out of like his regenerative capability?
Well, what's interesting is that when they originally find the creature, all they find is like the end of his tail. It was like frozen in ice. And then after they thaw it out, he regenerates completely from just the tip of his tail.
That's interesting. I'm sure the movie is not nearly as compelling as that premise sounds, but, you know, at least that's there.
All of the problems with that movie, honestly, are in the effects.
Effects that's really usually bad. Where most of these movies fall down. Yeah.
But the concept is great.
Yeah, I'm sure the humans aren't amazing.
Yeah, they're not particularly memorable. Like, I couldn't tell you anything about them right now.
Right. Dutch people. So, back to War of the Gargantuas. Does it work as a standalone science fiction film? Because I think it does.
I think especially the English version, when they don't try to tie it to the Frankenstein movie.
Do you think
that Toho
the English
had already
version
made
is kind of better? It's less convoluted, I think, and I think that makes the point of it more clear.
From a plot point side of things, I do like it a little better, just because you don't have, like, it's always been a stretch to me to tie them to Frankenstein. Like, I've never bought into that 100%, you know what I mean? And I think the English version not having to do that helps, honestly.
Well, what ruins the Frankenstein thing is that it's simultaneously a sequel but also kind of a remake, because Sanda fills in the role of the Frankenstein monster in the flashbacks. So right. It's like a half sequel kind of to a movie. It's almost like a sequel to a movie we never saw in a way. We kind of did. That's what I think is kind of weird about it. But I'm with you. I think the English version works better as a standalone movie.
I mean, once they decided to make the creatures their own thing and not just have them be like little Frankensteins or whatever the fucking original concept was, I really don't know why they even left the Frankenstein thing in the script. Like,
well, they were. I mean, I still see why. I mean, design-wise, they're basically just hairier, more primitive versions of the Frankenstein we saw in Frankenstein Conquers the World. It's just that in the execution of telling the story, they just went, well, we don't want to tie this too much into that because because we just don't do that. We don't really make direct sequels like that. Then we're just going to basically remake the scenes that were supposed to be from Frankenstein Conquers the World with Sonda instead. But we're still going to kind of make it a sequel to Frankenstein Conquers the World by mentioning the hand. But nobody mentioned... They mentioned Frankenstein, though, in the movie, in the Japanese version. Like, they're like Frankenstein. Yeah, in that they're like Frankenstein was a thing, and this is a product of him.
Yeah, they say Frankenstein all the time in the Japanese version. If I remember correctly.
I just it's more convoluted though, simply because it's a half remake, half sequel. So I agree with you. I think the English version works better as a standalone thing, and also just because what the Gargantuas are don't have to have anything to do with Frankenstein. They're just these unkillable organisms. They're almost like a virus that looks like a big monkey, you know?
Sort of. That's what I love about, by and far, the thing that you leave this movie remembering is the fucking fight between the two of them. And this is before...
The one in the city, you mean, obviously.
Yeah, the big fight.
Yeah. I think they're both rather memorable, though. The first one has a lot more, personality, I think.
Yeah, and there's no energy attacks like in a Godzilla movie. It's just a straight up brawl. It's almost kung fu in some instances. It's like as if you're watching two Kongs duking it out. Like, it's fantastic.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Haruo Nakajima's favorite role.
Yeah. You actually got to see his eyes for once.
As Gaira, as some people like to call him.
Yep, good old Gaira. And then Sonda was played by the guy who actually played Kong in King Kong vs. Godzilla.
Oh, was he?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
I'm pretty. I could be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure. That's like information that I may have heard years ago that I'm just kind of spewing, but that's what I remember. He's taller. That guy's tall, so that's why I'm pretty sure that he played Sonda.
That guy gave a pretty good performance as well.
He's great.
I thought both of them did fantastically.
They're both interesting characters on their own too, which you don't always get in these kaiju movies. Like, Godzilla is interesting because he's, iconic and he's badass and he's just this force of nature that's
right. But most of the monsters he fights don't get to be that interesting. Like,
no, I mean, he didn't even really get that way until a couple movies in anyway. Like, initially he's just this ravenous animal. Like, that's it.
I mean, sure, he has some interesting enemies like Mothra and shit because she's got her own mythos and whatnot.
And Kong was different too, obviously.
And then he has some enemies that are cool in concept, like Space Godzilla, and then maybe not executed quite as well as the concept is. But does anybody find Megaguirus interesting? I don't think so.
Not as a character. I mean, she's basically just fucking. I mean, she's basically just they didn't do a whole lot of the hive monsters that laid nests and give birth to eggs in the Godzilla franchise, though, didn't they? Until 98, and then all of a sudden every single one was like that, including 2014, and kind of Shin Godzilla in a way.
Or like Ebra, who probably has the least personality of any Godzilla anime.
Yeah, but that movie has a lot of personality, and I think that makes up for Ebra. I feel like Ebra has kind of a personality.
Speaking of Ebra, I saw a video on Facebook earlier today that some dude in Asia caught a 14-pound lobster.
Yeah, I saw that too, yeah. And somebody was like, it's Ebra! And I'm like, Ebra is not a lobster, you piss hole.
No, it's a crawfish, isn't it?
Shrimp.
It's a shrimp?
Yeah.
I didn't think shrimp had the front claws.
They do, they're just really tiny.
Oh, because he has one small one and one giant one. I guess that's just
I think that's why he's supposed to be a shrimp and not a crawfish.
Oh, okay.
Because crawfish don't live in the ocean, don't they? They're like a river thing.
I think they can live in the ocean. I think they're
they're
saltwater.
Not known for that, though.
Crawfish.
Would your typical Toho 60s executive go, crawfish live in the ocean. We should make a monster based on a crawfish.
I don't know. They did with cuttlefish. Who would have thought cuttlefish?
Oh, you mean for Space Amoeba?
Yeah. They did a cuttlefish kaiju, so anything's possible, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. Okay. Anyway,
somebody green lit Ukondru.
True. Well, we're kind of far off now. So, what else did you want to say about War of the Gargantuas? What do you think of the human story?
It's fine. it's fairly serviceable, yeah.
One thing I think we'll get into a lot with this list, especially on my end, is that a lot of these movies from the actual science fiction scenario point of view, are really, really good. They are bogged down, though, by the kind of mindset of the time and how that reflects in the human story, and those characters just are not as compelling because they're so kind of ham-fistedly representative of the time, and that just doesn't hold up as well now.
Well, it's because when you're talking sci-fi films pre-Star Wars, which is what we're doing here,
that was the idea.
It's all still very B-movie, and so
By
a lot
and
of
large,
times,
yeah.
so a lot of times you don't get as much emphasis on like a human story as you do just like an out there concept that you might enjoy,
or just an intricate connection between the two of them. Like, there's a couple on my list where I'm like, that's done really well, like especially my number one. But in the case of War of the Gargantuas, I think it's kind of half and half. Like, it's sort of like half of it. Like, the humans are definitely very connected to the monster story, but at a certain point, especially like in the middle, you kind of forget they're there. Like, especially once Gyra starts... Excuse me, Gyra. Well, no, we shouldn't keep making fun of that guy. Once Gyra starts fighting the military...
Gyra is my favorite Keiju.
Alright, that's the last time. After this, I'm cutting it out! When Gyro fights the military, and then, he gets his ass kicked, and then Sonda comes in and saves him, that part is really dragged out. And it's awesome, and the special effects work is really incredible for the time. But, yeah, it's very long, and I think that the human story is imbalanced in that way, but it's a great fucking movie still.
And you get the feeling that Russ Tamblyn doesn't want to be there.
No, he didn't. He very much didn't.
That's what I'm saying. It comes through.
Yeah. He seems very, very, very bored and tired.
The girl's fine.
Yeah, she's great. So's the...
he just walks through the whole movie like, Gargantua.
And Kenji Sahara's great in it, too. He's the third scientist.
All right, yeah.
The guy in Frankenstein... I forget... The guy in Frankenstein Conquers the World who was Sakurai in King Kong vs. Godzilla. I love that dude. I don't know the actor's name, though. I think he's better because the character in Frankenstein Conquers the World has more depth. But even still, everybody in War of the Gargantuas is solid with what they're given and with the circumstances of Russ Tamblyn being unsatisfied with being in a movie in a Japanese movie. Anything else?
No.
All right.
I think in the interest of getting through our lists, we should probably go ahead and move on.
All right, so let me jump into my number 5 then. So my number 5, if I can get my goddamn phone open, but I know it off the top of my head, is Island of Lost Souls from 1932. Have you ever seen that one?
No, but I know of it. It's one of the adaptations of The Island of Dr. Moreau.
Correct. So this is the first one, at least the first one that I'm aware of. There are movies that predate it that I think are adaptations of H.G. Wells' books. I think he even directed one of them. I'm not sure about that. That's just what I imagine in my mind.
It's always crazy when you think the movie that you're familiar with is the first one, and then you find out that there was one before it. Like, I recently found out that the 1925 Phantom of the Opera isn't the first Phantom of the Opera film. There was one in there's one in 1916 that's been lost.
Yeah, it's like a Frankenstein thing where you find out the Universal Frankenstein is not the first Frankenstein, that there was the Edison version before that, which I think we watched together once. Like we watched.
We did.
That was
an interesting movie.
It's an awful movie, but yeah, it's certainly interesting. So anyway, Island of Lost Souls, not awful. Interesting, definitely. But it is the first adaptation of Island of Dr. Moreau that I'm aware of. And after we discussed doing this list, I was actually compelled to go back and listen to the audiobook of the original H.G. Wells novel Island of Dr. Moreau. And my God, it is a great fucking book. We talked about it off air once. He just really knows how to pace something like this. And the thing that he does with his science fiction stories that I love is that he doesn't fill them out with all this just unnecessary human drama. Like, the human story and the science fiction stuff is really intrinsically linked, and they're both just as interesting as each other because they're intrinsically linked. So he does that really well in that book.
Now, doesn't this movie cross a little bit into the horror genre as well?
It is, yeah, and a lot of the ones on my list do. This is definitely just as much a horror movie as it is a science fiction movie. But because of the source material and because of the way the story plays, it definitely does fit just as much into science fiction, if not more so. The book is way more science fiction. You know, and if you don't, and for those of you who aren't for some reason familiar with the Island of Dr. Moreau, it's basically about this scientist who, you know, he has this private island, and it turns out that on this island he's performing these vivisection experiments on these animals that he's turning into people through the act of extreme vivisection. And the way it's explained in the book, because that sounds like nonsense, obviously. Like, how do you turn an animal into a person with surgery? The way it's explained in the book, it does actually make a bit of sense, because he talks about how, well, you know, you don't have enough flesh to work with on the one animal to do that, so you ultimately have to take flesh from other animals and build it on top of the other one, and then have that heal to eventually get what is kind of a human shape. So, the way it's explained in the book, I think works for the story. The movie, though...
Anytime you read it in an H.G. Wells story, also, you know, you have to keep in mind that this is like the grandfather of science fiction. So, like, his stories are obviously very old and very dated, and it's very easy to look at them with, like, modern scientific knowledge and be like, that wouldn't work at all. But
of course, but even in the context of the story itself, it seems aware that this would not work in the real world, and that it's an exaggeration done as a social satire. And it's also almost just as much of that as it is a science fiction and horror movie. It's a social satire. I mean, not the movie, the book, I mean. The movie isn't really like that at all. The movie strictly kind of stays within sci-fi and horror. And the horror elements of it are really the thing that bog it down. Like, so story-wise, it is probably... I don't know if it's the most faithful to the book, but it kind of feels like it's the most faithful. The actual, like, transformation of the animals into the beast people is probably the most in line with the book. Like, I don't know what they do in the 70s version. I've never seen that. I've heard that one is like just really boring. It's not even really bad. And I've never seen the 90s one either, but I know about the 90s movie. Like the 90s
I watched a review of that one at some point, and from what I remember, it didn't seem to be very good.
No, it's infamously bad. And the making of that movie is one of, like, the most hellish filmmaking experiences in history. But in that, it's genetic engineering that Dr. Moreau uses to turn the animals into beast people. But in the original, just good old-fashioned cutting them open and letting them heal. It's a fucking terrifying. So, the movie... is a bit different in that it opens the same. So a guy is shipwrecked in the middle of the ocean. He's fucked. In the book, he's British. In the movie, he's American, of course. And he is just the most boring sack of shit you've ever met. He's just a fucking he's just a blank slate. He could be anybody. He could be you. He could be me. He could be any old piece of shit. And he's probably the weakest link in the movie, sadly. But it's fine. He doesn't have much to say. Because remember, this is 1932, D. This is pre-King Kong. So, talkies are still very experimental at this point, especially something this ambitious. Like, this is something on the scale of, like, a Universal monster movie, but with a potentially more ambitious goal.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Is Lugosi in this movie?
Lugosi is in this movie. He plays the Sayer of the Law. The Sayer of the Law is... Not
the
really.
Law.
Yeah, basically, except he's alive for most of it. Well, the book the book he dies, but in the movie he doesn't die. We don't see him die anyway. He is not. He's like he's the closest thing the beast people have to a leader that's not Moreau. Like, think of it this way: if Moreau is their god, the Sayer of the Law is like their archbishop, if that makes any sense, or like their pope. He kind of breaks down what Moreau says and then explains it to the beast people and enforces it.
He is to Dr. Moreau what Sam Jackson was to fucking John Candy in Django Unchained. Was that his first name? John? Whatever his name was.
John Candy. John Candy is an actor who's dead.
That's right. It's late. Calvin Candy in Django Unchained.
Yeah, that's sure. Okay. So that's a good analogy.
Sayer of the Law is the house nigga.
Oh God. No. He's kind of not, because there is that role is filled actually by another character named Mei Ling.
Shit.
Mei Ling is probably the closest adaptation from the book to the movie, because Moreau's kind of completely different, but I'm totally fine with it. Mei Ling is one of Moreau's experiments that kind of went. All of them go wrong. That's kind of the point. Like, he views all of them as failures, because his point is to turn an animal into a perfect human being, to make it completely indistinguishable. And all of his experiments he has viewed as failures. As he says in the book, every day the awful beast flesh fights back and grows back. He says that in the movie too.
Now, is it ever explained why he wants to do this apart from being a mad scientist?
Yes, in the book he does. In the movie, it's a little more vague, but it's still there. His whole thing is, I have the resources, so I'm just gonna do it. And
I can't.
But he makes an argument for that where he's like, if I don't do it because I can, nobody ever will. That's part of the problem with science these days. Everybody is so focused on application that we don't make any major discoveries because nobody just pours it into research, you know? He was
so worried about whether or not he could that he didn't stop to think if he should.
Yeah, but his whole thing is that shouldn't matter. He completely separates himself. We're talking about the book more than the movie. I'll get to the movie in a second. In the book, he completely separates himself from, like, reality. At one point, he sticks a knife into his thigh just to prove that he doesn't care about pain. Because in the book, the character's name is Prendig, the guy who gets shipwrecked and ends up on the island. He's like, how do you not just stop whenever you're doing these experiments because the animals whining turns into people screaming? Like, that's something that's very powerful in the book that is carried over into the movie. That at a certain point, he's not experimenting on an animal, he's experimenting on a person, and you can hear them scream. It's really, really off-putting. And it's a really good, powerful indication of what he's doing and why it's wrong. Because, of course, that's ultimately the point of all this, is that Moreau's a bad dude. Or
how do they explain the fact that these beast people are intelligent? Like,
he alters the brains. He alters their brains and hormones to release different chemicals and different amounts of chemicals to make them able to speak and make them able to think.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Again, it doesn't really make any sense, but you just kind of roll with it. It makes sense in the context of the world. And again, the point of all this is to go, wow, isn't this guy crazy? But doesn't it have some merit to it, though? Because you couldn't do anything with it. I mean, of course, the scale to which he's performing surgery is certainly a breakthrough in and of itself. But what is he going to do with it, ultimately? Like, what is the practical application of turning animals into people? If anything, that's just inherently a bad idea. It's all about what it means for the grander field of science.
Aside from breeding a non-human slave population, I can't imagine any
well, that's the thing. That's what it's about, though, because the book in particular really gets into, well, how much are these animals actually people? You know, after they've been experimented on by Moreau, because they act like kind of stereotypical, like, primitive kind of people. Like, they have a very primitive society. They wear rags. They have a basic kind of religion. They're very superstitious. They speak in, like, these very short, quick, brief sentences because they just learned English. Or not just. Like, some of them have been around for a while. Like, he's been on that island for 10 years before Prendig or Parker in the movie gets there. Let me transition to the movie, because that's what we're talking about here.
Right.
I've been kind of shitting on it as we've been talking about it, but it's great. Again,
I just have one more question about him and his motivations.
Go for it.
If he considers all these experiments failures, why does he allow them to live?
Because he doesn't care.
Like, wouldn't he save himself a lot of trouble if he just killed them?
Yeah, but there is no trouble. He just lets them live on his island, and he doesn't really have anything to do with them. In the book, anyway.
But isn't part of the premise that they, like, revolt against him by the end, or did that not happen in the book?
Oh, that very much happens in the book, but it takes a long. That doesn't happen for 10 years. Again, he's on that island for 10 years before anything goes wrong. It's actually largely the fault of the fucking shipwreck victim that it happens in the first place, especially in the book. In the movie,
maybe it's just because I'm living in the 21st century and movies exist and I've seen enough of them. But if I were on an island creating animal people, I don't think I'd allow the failures to live, because revolt is just.
It's all about the kind of character he is. He is not in his right state of mind. Obviously, he is a fucking sick lunatic, and he's not the main character for that reason. Like, he doesn't get introduced in the book until, like, fucking 6 chapters in. And then in the movie, it takes like 15 minutes before you finally see him. And he's definitely not the main character in the movie. But the whole idea of him is that he's completely separated himself from any kind of, like, need, like any kind of, like, desire or want any kind of physical need. Like he doesn't feel pain. At one point he sticks a knife into his thigh just to prove like I don't care. It doesn't do anything to me. So he simply
Class is dismissed.
He simply exists. Yeah, exactly. I wonder if that was a reference to that. Maybe. So the idea of him is that I exist to further my field and to further knowledge. I want to see if this can be done. That is my one desire. So that's the whole kind of idea. In the movie, though, and back to Island of Lost Souls, the movie, he's a very different character. He's like incredibly flamboyant in the movie. He's played by Charles Laughton, who really, really makes this movie worth watching. Watch this movie if for nothing else than his performance, because he is fucking incredible. His performance is subtle, which is incredibly rare for this time period. Usually a character like Moreau, who is this, kind of misanthropic, very outsiderish kind of, mad scientist character, you'd think you'd play him like a cackling, over-the-top theatrical lunatic, right? Yeah. Charles Laughton doesn't really do that. He's a cackling kind of lunatic, but he's a lot more subdued. And he's a lot more like he's like an Andy Warhol type, but before Andy Warhol. He's always just like, oh, like at one point he goes like, so at one point he breaks down what he did to Parker, the shipwreck victim. And he goes, getting them to talk you have to have so much patience. Like, it takes so long to get them to talk. And then he just looks at him and he goes, maybe one day I'll make a woman and it'll be easier. Like, but he says that really like very low, and like he's not like, maybe one day I'll make a woman and it'll be easier. Yeah. He's like, maybe one day I'll make a woman. It's great. And his performance is filled with that. At one point he's like, there's this great moment where he's describing what he did to Parker. And Parker just starts losing it. Like, he's like, you mean these sad, pitiful people that are chasing me in the jungle, they're animals that you put through horrible surgery and turned into people? And he just walks over to this operating table, right? And he just kind of lays on it, on his hip, and he just kind of like, he's kind of splayed, and he just kind of looks at Parker just smiling. Just this shit-eating grin on his face, just taking in this guy just having this panic attack at this horrible truth that he's learned. It's great. It's fantastic. The problem is that the human stuff outside of that is a mixed bag. Parker is kind of awful. But what else do you want from him? He's a block of wood. Like, he's just this generic, just kind of everyman. He's this kind of prissy, like, kind of vaguely kind of masculine dude. He's engaged to be married. He's Jonathan Harker from Dracula. It is exactly the character that he fills. And
he's 30s stock horror leading man.
Yeah, and the actor he's clearly not used to acting on film. Because all of his dialogue is stilted. He was clearly a silent film actor that they then accosted to be a talkie actor. And Laughton, I'm pretty sure, was a stage actor who may have dabbled into some silent films, but he was primarily a stage actor, and I really think that helps his performance. Outside of that, though, we've been going on for a long time about this. I apologize. Outside of that, though, the Beast People are all really good. They're exactly the same as the book, and that's really important because they're kind of the key thing that we're trying to analyze here and trying to dig into. The makeup is all... What's good about the makeup is that it uses the limitations that the book already put forward to make them scarier and to make them more off-putting, because the book already is like, these are not these gigantic, like, freaks of, like, just like hybrids. They're people with some vague kind of animalistic qualities about them. And that's what the makeup does. It's these very... What's off-putting about them is that you look at them and they look like people, but there's something about them that's off. Some of them are hunched over too much, their faces are too dark, they have too much hair, some of them have pointy ears. And I mean, it's more obvious on some of them. Like, some of them have hooves, some of them have, like, fucking, like, monkey faces, and, there's... there's certainly
Some of them get excited and hump your leg when you come in the
yeah,
door.
exactly. So, there's a wide variety, but they're all rather subtle, and the makeup really is enhanced by that. I don't know who did the makeup for the movie. It's not a Universal movie. I think it's Paramount. It may have been Jack Pierce. Like, obviously they got Lugosi over from Universal, so they may have gotten Jack Pierce, but it is...
And this is back in the days of, like, heavy-ass rubber makeup, before they had, like, the shit
Oh,
that they
this
used.
isn't rubber, my friend. Don't be fucking like you're
Or
fucking
whatever.
fancy ass rubber. Oh,
Or whatever the fuck they had to
this
use
is
on,
low tech
what's his
spirit gum and yak hair, and this is all the old school shit, my friend.
Well, I know, like, for Boris Karloff, like, they had to sculpt this, like, heavy-ass thing for his
It's
forehead and
spirit
everything.
gum. It's not. It's there. They didn't have rubber at that time. They had latex, I think, but even still, they didn't have.
Or they have,
that.
like, they had some kind of a putty or something. I've watched shit about this.
Yeah, me too. It was a lot harder. You had to apply it on every day. It was a sculpt from the ground up. It's not like a rubber mask. You have to apply it every day and rebuild it from the ground up. And
that's how Pierce kind of got edged out of the business, because then all of a sudden the sexier makeups that they could mass produce started coming out that like they just had to slap on and pull off at the end of the day, and it was no problem.
You got to your Bob Chapman era of like, is that what the guy's name was? I don't know, but Buddy, there was some guy who took over. Bud Westmore, maybe was his name. There was some guy who took over from Jack Pierce.
I think it was Westmore, and that family is still like big in the industry or whatever.
Yeah,
but like
they're the rubber mask dudes. Yeah.
Yeah, and for a while there was like a dip in quality, because once those like easier to do makeups first came out, they weren't as good looking as like the old school ones.
No.
But then once you get to like mid 60s, they look just as convincing as anything else ever did, so it was fine.
Yeah, that's what they did for the 70s Moreau movie, or maybe that's a 60s movie. I don't know. And those that's really good makeup as well. But the makeup in this, it's a different feel. I think it works better for the material in a way that the other two movies simply just can't, because of the time periods they're made in. The subtlety of it, and the fact that it just looks like their abnormalities are growing out of them just because of the way the makeup is applied, it really works with the fact that these are animals that have been just butchered to the point of looking like people and are just having their animalistic qualities try to fight back and grow back. It works very well. Now, there are elements that are introduced into the movie that aren't in the book. One, Panther Woman. In the movie, all of the beast people are men. There are no female beast people.
Well, what's the deal with the line about making a woman if he already made a woman? What the fuck?
Well, that's the thing though. It's like he's supposed to be like, but I already have, and she's 10 times better than anything else I've made. But again, this is a product of the time. She was like your sexy, like, oh, the exotic Panther Woman. Come see Island of Lost Souls for that. She's just like...
Does she do a dance in order to obtain the atmospherium? And then...
You'd think. Sadly, she does not. What she does do, though, is talk in broken English, has slightly dark skin, and tries to seduce the main character, even though he's engaged. And at one point, and this is where the movie really kind of falls off the rails, sadly, somebody comes to rescue him. In the book, he's stuck there. There's nobody coming for him. In the movie, there's a rescue party who come to get him like only after he's been on the island for like a day. So it's just not near. It's just not as, the stakes aren't as high. So then these people come to get him. They break him out. They save him. That's where the big climax happens. That's when the revolt happens, and that's all fine. The problem with it is just there's this cliched element of the time of, well, now there's all these characters here. There's like this captain of a boat who's come to save the shipwreck victim. There's his fiance who's like this beautiful, fragile blonde woman. You have all this crap, and it's all done fine for the time, but it's just all a staple of the time that distracts from what's important. But the ending is amazing. There's this very iconic speech that Bela Lugosi delivers to Dr. Moreau, where he's like, "You made us in the house of pain. You made us things, not men, not beast, things." That's like the best part of the movie.
How is he in the movie overall?
Bela Lugosi, he's great. He's barely in it, but he's great. And what I also like is that they kept it from the book, where it's entirely vague what the fuck animal he's supposed to be. I think he's supposed to be a shrew, but that's just based on the visual. Like in the book they make a point out of, I have no idea what the fuck this guy was made from. And in the movie, they don't even get into it. They don't get into a lot of what they're made from, except for the ones that are like really important and get names and stuff. So anyway, it's a great movie. It's very entertaining. If you like the H.G. Wells story, it's worth watching. If you're interested in H.G. Wells stories and you're reluctant to get into them because of the time period and because they might not hold up to you, give this a watch. It's super short. It's only like an hour and 12 minutes long. So give it a go. It's worth it for the time period, for the time that it runs over. It's fun. It's it's super well made for the time. The acting in it, again, it's mixed, but the acting that's good is really good, and it's worth watching just for that. And it's probably the best adaptation of The Island of Dr. Moreau. So that's pretty much all I'll say about it.
If you've never read an H.G. Wells story in your life, but you've seen like The Invisible Man, and you thought, oh, that was good, you know.
I may talk about that one later. But yeah,
I don't know. Maybe
if you like The Invisible Man, you'll like Island of Lost Souls.
Maybe it's just because it's in my Universal like horror Blu-ray collection, but I didn't even think to put Invisible Man on this list, even though it would totally qualify.
It's barely a horror movie, though, is the thing.
Yeah, I never think of it in that light. Same thing for like Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it when we get there. But what's your number 4?
Okay, so 2 kaiju movies in a row.
Beware!